Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Future History Project. And we have finished this week, or finishing the fourth week of the Future History Project, the robot stories. We've been reading from The Complete Robot by Isaac Asimov. And this week we finished reading the last two Powell and Donovan stories, and we began the first three of the Susan Calvin stories. Now, I'm going to, at the end of this video, talk about what we're going to read next week, but also I wanted to talk a little bit about Susan Calvin. And I'll keep with, at the beginning, I'll keep within the sort of confines of the story, and then I'll talk about Asimov and his creation of the character as well. Something that is missing from the Complete Robot, which I'm not sure why they didn't put this in, is the introduction to iRobot that was the first collection of his robot stories in 1950. Again, one of these great covers of Harper Voyager. In the it's a collection of the stories up to that point, which includes the Powell and Donovan stories and the Susan Calvin stories that were written at the time. So there's a little difference in order with these because he wrote some later ones that fit in to the Susan Calvin timeline. Now, we'd already seen that he had made some changes to stories, interpolations with Robbie, and he had Susan Calvin appear in it, and that was done for the publication of iRobot. But in the introduction, Susan Calvin is she's being interviewed by a reporter from the Interplanetary Press, and she is retiring basically. So the year is 2057 or 2058, give or take. I would say 2058 because at the beginning he quotes the Three Laws of Robotics, and it's the Handbook of Robotics, 56th edition, 2058. And in the introduction, he introduces Susan Calvin as being born in 1982, receiving her BA in 2003 from Columbia University, and in 2008 she got her PhD and started working for U.S. Robots and Mechanical Men, and which also started in 1982. And he gives a bit of a brief history. It was started by Lawrence Robertson, who was president, and then later Alfred Lanning became director of research, and he shows up in a number of the stories as well. And the reporter is talking to Dr. Calvin because she is retiring, and he wants to know about robots basically, and he wants her to talk about the stories. And because she was there from the ground floor up, basically, she talks about having a small office, and it was just one building, and they were building 3 robots a week. They couldn't talk, and now U.S. Robots is a complex that's the size of a city. It's the biggest corporation that the world had ever seen. And so she starts opening up about robots, and that this is where she says that she remembers seeing about Robbie. She never actually saw the robot Robbie, but she saw the child in the museum, which he puts in, and then it goes into Robbie as the first story, and and this was like late 1990s in the timeline, and so that means Susan Galvin was in her teens, in her mid teens, when she saw Gloria at the museum in the storyline. So the stories in here, if you do have a copy, or you can find the introduction somewhere, it's worth reading, because it is kind of interesting, because it's sort of like Asimov is putting himself as the interviewer uh, of Susan Calvin and taking down these stories. But they have Robbie is the first one, Run Around, Reason, and Catch That Rabbit. Those were the three Powell and Donovan ones uh, that we'd read. And then Liar, Little Lost Robot, Escape, Evidence, and the Evitable Conflict. Now, we'll be reading, well, I'll get to that in a little bit. We'll be reading some of these, but not all of them, for next week from the Complete Robot. So we've got a situation here where he sort of retrofit the stories by adding little things, adding the introduction about Susan Calvin being born in 1982, and then he added other stories, and we will eventually start reading a few other stories written by a couple other writers, short stories that are in the Foundation's Friends. And then we will be reading the trilogy that's by Mickey Reichart, I think it is, or something. Reichart is the name of the trilogy of Susan Calvin. The timeline there is not very good. I think he moves it further in time rather than that it should be around the 2020s or 2030s, but he puts it later, I think. But let's sort of fast forward a little bit to 1982 itself. And by this time, Isaac Asimov had written a lot of other stuff, and he started writing back the into the Foundation, the future history universe, I guess you would say. But also from, I think it was 1977, a magazine called Isaac Asimov's Science Fiction magazine had started. He was not the editor, but he wrote the editorials. And this here is a collection. It's called Asimov's Galaxy, Reflections on Science Fiction by Isaac Asimov. And these are the editorials from Isaac Asimov's Isaac Asimov's Science Fiction magazine. This was published in 1989. Says January 1989, first edition here. So we've got a number of little essays, editorials, and one of them that came out in December 1982 is called Susan Calvin, and he recounts the story which he told in his autobiography of how Susan Calvin came into being. Liar was the third story that he wrote, third robot story, or just third robot story that he had written. And he actually he wanted to have a woman as the main character, but he was just like 21, because he started writing this, he finished it in late 1940, and it was eventually published in May 1941 in Astounding. And he admits that, his experience with women was almost zero at being 20 and 21 years old. But he wanted, as I say, he wanted a female as the main character. And he sort of modeled the character on one of his professors, Mary Caldwell, who was, she was the guidance counselor for graduate students, and as he says, she was pro Asimov, so therefore he was pro Caldwell, because not too many professors at that time were pro Asimov, so he did like her. So he wrote the story, and it was Susan Caldwell. But he started thinking, well, what if she doesn't like the idea of him writing a story? And he's still a student at this time, remember? And so he didn't want to, because she was pro Asimov, he didn't want her to be anti Asimov. So he quickly called up. He'd already submitted the story, so he called up and he talked to Kay Tarrant, who was John W. Campbell called her a secretary, but she was more than that. She sort of ran a lot of parts of Astounding with John W. Campbell. She was very important. She was there for 30 years or more years as well. And she was sort of the first port of call for people like that. She ran sort of defense for Campbell as well. So he called her up and says, I need this changed, and she's saying, well, so you want me to go through and change the name, every character that's Caldwell to what? And he couldn't think of it. And then all of a sudden he thought of Calvin. And a lot of people have been written to thinking that it is, the reformer John Calvin, but he says no, it has nothing to do with it. It just he grabbed the name Calvin. So that's the basis from like 1940, beginning of the end of 1940, 1941, of the creation of Liar and Susan Calvin. So as I say, let's move on to in 1950, then he wrote the introduction to iRobot, and he put in he changed the Robbie and everything for her to be in. And he wrote the introduction, say she was born in 1982 and she's retiring at 75, and the U.S. robots are 75 as well. But in December sometime during 1982, a letter came from Australia with a newspaper clipping. The newspaper clipping, and he didn't really sort of note it too much until later, was from 1st of April 1982 issue of the West Australian, the writer's local paper. And he circled a birth notice. And the birth notice said, Calvin, to Elizabeth and Jeremy, a daughter, Susan, born 30th of March, 1982. Sincere thanks to Dr. Asimov from all who have long awaited this event. And he says, so 1982, this is something that he didn't quite predict, but he was quite amazed at this, Asimov was. And he goes on and he starts, extrapolating the possibility, but she's born in Australia, but he's saying that she went to Columbia, but, well, he wasn't born in the U.S., he went to Columbia, and so she could conceivably go to Columbia and get her bachelor's degree for 2003. There are, in 1982, at that time, there was no U.S. robots and mechanical men company in existence in the United States. There was, the closest was Unimation company at the time that had been founded like many years before. But he sort of postulates, well, that if Susan continues, if this Susan, Caldwell continues because of knowing about the stories, she could conceivably go for cybernetics and robotics as a graduate and PhD. And he sort of goes further because of her name, her profession, that some robotics company that had started or is going to start would change its name. And yeah, it seems potentially uh, plausible, because it would be a good marketing ploy to do this if given you're hiring Susan Calvin, the namesake of Susan Calvin in the robot in Isaac Asimov's robot stories. So he goes on to say that, and uh, so he's saying about just how prophecy could happen, and he extrapolates all this, but he realizes that the he didn't really think that the timeline would happen the way it was with the types of robots. But in 1982 he thought, well, maybe it would be a little more realistic from 1982's point of view. But as we know, it didn't hasn't worked out like that. So and then the interesting thing is too, and then there was an addendum to the letter, uh, or basically almost like a final paragraph to the letter, by the person who sent the birth notice, and it says, "Note to Dr. Asimov: further investigation on my part found Elizabeth's maiden name, and that's the child Susan's mother, to be Caldwell. Surprised?" And like he sort of says, and uh, that it would be interesting if this Susan Calvin would take as her middle name Caldwell. So it'd be Susan Caldwell Calvin. And so he admits that he's told the story of the creation of the name of Calvin from Caldwell in his autobiography, so the writer of the letter knew about this. But then he in this edition here, he writes it afterward. He says, "After this essay was published, I began to feel deflated. The more I thought of it, the more significant it began to seem that the birth announcement had appeared in a paper dated 1st of April. Had I fallen to an April Fool joke? Maybe I had, but I have no evidence for it, so I'll let the essay stand." I'm sure it was a joke, uh, but yeah. So I find that interesting, and as I was saying, the continuity of the stories, because they're retrofitted, don't quite work, because in one of the stories she talks about that it's 50 years since Second World War, and that doesn't quite jive with her age, with gray hair and everything in the story. But oh well. It's a willing suspension of disbelief, and enjoy the stories for what they are, and how the evolution of robots. And that's where, if you get a chance to read the introduction to iRobot, it's worthwhile to do. Is just to have a quick look at it. So next week's stories, there are 5 more Susan Calvin stories that we'll be reading, and we're reading them in the order that are in the Complete Robot. And the first one is Galley Slave, then Little Lost Robot, Risk, Escape, and Evidence. And then there will be 2 more within here for week 6. But I'll list everything down in the notes, and it's just a fun little thing. Like I say, it clearly was. Sorry, wrong book. It clearly was, an April Fool's joke. But it's kind of cool, because potentially, something like that could happen. Like, if parents were fans of Isaac Asimov, and their name happened to be Calvin, and I'm sure there is somebody out there, and if they happen to have a daughter in 1982, or even at any other time, I'm sure there is a Susan Calvin out there somewhere in the world. The chances are quite high that there is a Susan Calvin out there named after Susan Calvin in the stories. But anyway, this is for next week. So we're on to week 5 now, and I hope everybody's enjoying the project, and it will be ongoing. And if there's any questions or concerns, either in the comments or send me an email. My email is down in the in the description, and let me know what's which is great. Like I'm hearing some comments of people saying, so which story is their favorite and why at times. So it's great to hear this because everybody there's similarities and then there's differences. And what do you think of the Susan Calvin stories so far? Or if you've read them before, what do you think of them in general? And the Powell and Donovan. I know the Powell and Donovan is either hit or miss with a lot of people. And the reason why that like he's put them in here is because while he had written them, but also too, they work for the U.S. Robots and Mechanical Men Incorporated. So and that's where Susan Calvin is too. So they are related. The stories are related, and she is mentioned in a couple of stories anyway. So we'll leave it there, BookTube, and I hope you have a good reading week, and I will see you next week. Take care.